Carol Beaumont.
Thank you very much, Mr Speaker. It's my pleasure as Labor's Consumer Affairs spokesperson to rise and speak on the third reading of the Motor Vehicle Sales Amendment Bill. As we have been previously noting, we are supporting this bill. It is a bill that has a number of very sensible amendments. It's not a bill that's going to set the world on fire or indeed necessary to be dealt with under urgency, but is a good solid piece of work. Now, I want to talk first of all about why legislation in the consumer affairs area is important, and of course this bill, the Motor Vehicle Sales Amendment Bill, is part of our consumer legislation. Motor vehicles are of course significant items for many New Zealanders. For the many New Zealanders who can no longer afford to buy houses, and that is an increasing number of New Zealanders, it may well be the biggest single purchase that they make. So consumer legislation around motor vehicle sales is important. The motor vehicle industry is also one that employs a number of people, and we've seen many people lose their jobs in the motor vehicle industry through the recession. And of course, in tough economic times, people are reliant on cars in New Zealand. In most places in New Zealand, they are reliant on cars because they don't have an alternative. That public transport isn't going to be the way that they get to work. They require a car to get around, to get to work, take the kids to school, whatever. And so this is a purchase that is often not an optional purchase for New Zealanders. I think we'd all accept that. Some of us are probably more committed to changing that situation and having alternatives, but the reality is it's very significant. So I just wanted to put this in a context, if you like. This Motor Vehicle Sales Amendment Bill is actually dealing with an issue that is quite important to us, the sale of motor vehicles. Now, the process around this, as has been outlined, this was a piece of legislation brought in by the previous Labor government, a very significant piece of legislation, the Motor Vehicle Sales Act, which came into effect in December 2003 and provided for some very important things. It provided for the registration of motor vehicle traders, and we all know that used car salesmen, I'm not sure where we stack up against them at the moment, but the old saying, they're certainly not seen as the most honest and reliable people in the world often. I can't remember if politicians are above or below them at the moment, but there was a need to try and tighten up that industry. And so that was one part of that legislation, setting up the disputes tribunal so people had somewhere to go to deal with any disputes that they might have. And I've previously noted that this seems to be working very effectively, the disputes tribunal. And thirdly, around the issue of consumer information, the sorts of things you might expect to know when you are purchasing a vehicle. So that was set up in December 2003 with a requirement that the Act be reviewed after 2 years in operation. I think that's important actually, especially in an area like consumer law where things change. Who would have thought that the amount of buying and selling that takes place on the online trading area would have been the case even then in 2003. So the fact is consumer law is an area we need to review fairly regularly. So that process led to a review, a number of areas identified, 12 areas identified as possibly needing amendment from the Motor Vehicle Sales Act, and a discussion document went out. A number of people commented on that. That fed into a process where there was a bill put into the House, and that bill was introduced in May 2009. So it hasn't had a speedy track through the House since that time. It was referred to the Commerce Committee, and I'm pleased to note my colleague, the chair of that select committee, the Honourable Leanne Dalzell, who provides a very good leadership role in that committee, and it was important that this bill went there. It's had good, thorough scrutiny. It's had good assistance by officials, by all accounts. That was reported back in December 2009. The second reading occurred in June 2010. So after a slow start, here we are in urgency dealing with the committee stages and the third reading. It's a little unclear to me what is so urgent about the Motor Vehicle Sales Amendment Bill that warrants us being here in urgency to deal with it. That is not to say that the amendments in it are not useful and helpful amendments, but it does seem a little strange given the pressing issues that are facing New Zealand at the moment: high unemployment, lack of an economic plan, New Zealanders struggling to make ends meet, that we are dealing under urgency with what are effectively fairly minor changes to the Motor Vehicle Sales Act. So just what are those amendments? Well, as has been outlined, they are a number of amendments that include changes to the process whereby motor vehicle traders renew their annual registration, and partly that was driven by a desire to reduce compliance costs on traders. One that is really important and should be, I think, one that is valued by all of us is a requirement for closing a loophole that prevents the automatic banning of traders whose registration has lapsed following conviction under this Act. So that's important. That should happen, and that's being fixed up by this bill. It then also deals with a set of changes around consumer information notices, primarily around the use of those notices in car markets, and essentially recognises the fact that people operating a car market are not, by definition, motor vehicle traders themselves. They're providing a space where people buy and sell cars. So it also removes the requirement for transactions between traders or traders and wreckers to display a consumer information notice. That's probably okay. You would expect that those people would be aware of their rights and be aware of the information that they are needing to decide on whether or not to purchase a motor vehicle. And it does increase the financial, so the third area is around the Motor Vehicle Disputes Tribunal, and it increases the financial limit from $50,000 to $100,000. Now again, I've already said that we think that this Disputes Tribunal appears to work well, that they are effective in their decision making, that they are dealing with an increasing number of cases, that they do draw to our attention matters that are of interest or indeed matters for further law change, so that's all positive. And we have no issue with extending the amount from $50,000 to $100,000, but it would be fair to say that this is not going to affect most New Zealanders. Most New Zealanders are not in the market for a vehicle that is worth more than $50,000. You'd have to accept that. In tough economic times, in fact, people are holding on to their old vehicles, looking at downsizing often, especially with fuel prices being what they are, little or no wage increases. So it's not exactly something that's probably going to affect the majority of struggling New Zealanders, but certainly we don't have a problem with it being in there. Again, I would say that it's not the key issue facing this Parliament at the moment. Now, I do want to go on and just put this in a context of consumer affairs generally. I think that we could judge this bill in light of a framework, and I alluded to this previously to the new Minister of Consumer Affairs, that we're looking at a framework around consumer affairs, and I seek to meet him to discuss this, but it looks at things like improving consumer knowledge and protection, so you could certainly say that to a degree this bill is part of that. Secondly, that it needs to really take account of the needs of vulnerable consumers. Now, I'm not sure that this bill really touches into that area particularly, although the Motor Vehicle Sales Act is important because, as I said, cars are one of the biggest single items for many consumers that they may purchase. But the government has failed to show much leadership in the area of vulnerable consumers. And I think that the fact that National and ACT MPs voted against the Loan Shark bill not that long ago shows, in fact, a disinterest in the interests of vulnerable consumers. I do know that Mr Boscawen, Honourable John Boscawen, does have a concern about vulnerable consumers, and I will be seeing if he wants to take a changed tack on that issue of vulnerable consumers. Targeting exploitation, well, I think we really need to look at what we're doing in the area of the motor vehicle market at the bottom end, if you like. And I identified one part of Auckland where it's particularly an issue, and that's Otahu. So again, I think this bill in itself is not in that space, but I think that there is enforcement work particularly that could help. Updating consumer law, well, clearly that's part of our framework, and we see this does sit within there. It takes account of changed circumstances, and that is important. Greater regulation, that's probably something we're going to debate. and increasing consumer awareness. So I'll end it there. Thank you, Mr Speaker.